All right, so at this time we have talked about the difference between distance and displacement. We've talked about how to measure those things. They're both measured in meters, and so in order for something to travel, it takes time for that to happen, right? So now that we've learned and understand how to determine the distance or the displacement that an object has traveled, what if we also were keeping track with the amount of time that it took for that motion to occur? Well, with that additional information, we could now figure out what the speed or the velocity is of that object. So the first thing I want to talk about is the use of the word speed compared to the use of the word velocity. This, once again, is a pair of words that people often use interchangeably, and in casual conversation, that's really not a problem. In this class, however, it is important, similarly to distance and displacement, that you understand that they both technically have slightly different interpretations or definitions, and understanding the differences is going to be important for you to be able to interpret the question correctly and produce the correct final answer. So for right now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the vocabulary word speed. Okay, this is specifically about the vocabulary word speed. So if we're looking for a short, quick, brief description of speed, it's how fast. We can absolutely say that speed is how fast. But if you look at the definition, it says here that speed is going to be a how fast, but it's going to be based off of the distance and the time. So if we understand the difference between distance and displacement, maybe we need to take a moment to recall that distance was scalar, where we didn't care about the direction that the object moved. So when we're talking about speed, since we are defining speed as being how fast, using the distance and the time, speed is also going to be scalar. Now let me pause for a moment. Let's just spell it out. Time is scalar. There is no direction with time, okay? You always just count up to the next number. It doesn't matter if you're standing on your head, if you're going north, if you're going in reverse, if you're spinning around in circles. Time is time. There is no positive, negative time, right? There's no direction with time. So obviously time is scalar. So speed is going to be a scalar quantity. It's not going to have a direction, and it's going to be calculated using the distance that the object has traveled in meters and the time that it took that motion to take place. And in this particular class, we're going to want that time to be in seconds, okay? So you can see here that my units for speed are meters per second. Meters per second. All right, so then let's look at some of the information I have hidden down here at the moment. So our formula for speed is going to be expressed as distance divided by time. It says in the definition that we're saying how fast using distance and time, but it's really important that you use those variables in the correct way. So we're going to take the distance traveled, which is going to be measured in meters, and we're going to divide that by the amount of time that it took in seconds, okay? So when we are talking about formulas, in this class, we are going to have a variety of variables that we're going to be using. So in this particular formula, we're going to have speed, distance, and time. All three of those variables are going to be needed in order for us to solve the questions. So you can only have one unknown variable in a particular formula. So in this case, if we wanted to figure out what the speed is, we would need to know the distance and the time, and we would need to divide them specifically so that distance is in our numerator and time is in the denominator. We will provide you guys with the formulas for all of the calculations that you'll need to do in here, but I'm not going to be writing the vocabulary words out in those equations. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use the notation like what you see here on the right side. So when I provide equations for you, I will be writing it in this format. So I'm going to just simply put V equals D over T on the board, and that's going to be your working formula. Now, some teachers might choose to write the equation for speed as S equals D over T. I will not be doing that. The official formula is V equals D over T. Now you might be questioning, why are we using a V instead of an S? Because when we move on to the vocabulary word velocity, which is with a V, we will see that it's also a how fast. So rather than having two separate equations to learn, we are just going to use V equals D over T, even though we're calculating for speed. As we learn more specifics about velocity, we'll come back and revisit the equation and make sure we understand the difference between the two types of calculations. But for right now, V will be our speed, D is going to be our distance, and T is going to be the time. Okay, so speed is equal to distance over time. So when we do our math work, we're going to end up with a unit of meters per second. We're going to express this as meters per second with a slash. That's how we're going to write it, and that's how we're going to read it. But I've gone ahead and put it so that we clearly had distance in meters in our numerator and a time of seconds in our denominator. And as we continue to work through math work in this class, you will find that there are some equations that it really is helpful if you can clearly visually represent your numerator and denominator. So I wanted to go ahead and show you that meters per second with the slash really and truly means meters in the numerator and seconds in the denominator, and you can always rewrite that so that there's a clear top and bottom, or numerator and denominator, if that helps you to process the information, because we're going to do a lot of critical thinking. We're going to need to rearrange formulas, and sometimes that visual representation makes a big difference. What I'm going to do now is go over what we call the guess process. And so this is the format that we're going to use for all of the math work that we're going to do in this class. You will be graded based off of your execution of this process. And as we move forward in the first couple of chapters, I will give you lots of reminders and specific explanations about where your points are coming from and how you're going to be graded. But for right now, let's just lay out what that process looks like. So the first thing we're going to do is identify the variables that we are given in the problem. So here it says that we want to know what is the speed of a dog that runs 5 meters in 2 seconds. So we have a variable expressed to us as 5 meters. So you should know that this is going to be a how far. And so that's going to be our D in the equation, and it's going to have a value of 5 and a unit of meters. It's really important that we always express the value with that unit, because if for some reason this was not given to us in meters, we would need to make that adjustment before we could move forward in our calculation. We have obviously a time here of 2 seconds. And so now I have done G, I've listed my givens. The next thing I need to do is identify the unknown variable. In other words, what variable am I supposed to be solving for? What is the question about? Well, the question asks, what is the speed? So speed, which is going to be V in our formula, is the variable that I'm solving for. And so I like to put a question mark there. As our questions get more complex and we have to do multi-step problems, this is my indication of what I'm solving for, so I'm not finished with the problem until I have that specific variable. The next step says to write the equation, which for right now, there's only one for us to pick from. As we have more choices, we'll revisit that step. The word guess has 2 S's, and so the first S stands for substitution. So I am writing the equation so that I can now put the numbers where they belong in the formula, because in my class, you will not be provided the equation with the numbers written in. It will be your job to put the numbers in the right place. So it's really important that you are identifying your variables carefully and correctly so that you can set up the correct math problem. Again, as the formulas and the problems get more complex, if you have not correctly learned this skill, then the questions are going to be much more challenging than what they should be, because this very simple step is really crucial to solving the problems correctly, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the equation and recognize that I don't know what the value is for the letter V. In fact, that's what it's asking me to solve for. So I'm going to say V equals. The next thing in my formula is asking me for my displacement, or my distance, excuse me. And so I can see on my list that I have a value for that distance. So instead of writing a D, I'm going to put a 5 in that place, because that's what the list tells me belongs there. The variable time I have written on my list as a 2, so I'm just simply going to write a 2 in. In this particular case, my unknown variable is already isolated, so I don't need to do any rearranging. I'm just going to put in my calculator 5 divided by 2, and that's going to give me a value of 2.5. So V equals 2.5 meters per second is the right way to write this final answer. Again, we've already discussed sig figs. Remember, we're going to go with the least number of significant figures given to us in the problem. In this particular case, both variables were actually only one significant figure. But remember, if you are in Miss Espinosa's class, then we are going to have the Espinosa rule, which says that every answer must have a minimum of 2 sig figs. So instead of rounding this to 3 meters per second, I left it as a 2.5. So I have at least 2 significant figures in my final answer. All right, let's go ahead and do one more question here. Here it says that they want us to know how much time does it take for a car that is moving 21.5 meters per second to travel 68.4 meters. So I have a speed of 21.5 meters per second. I have a distance of 68.4 meters. It's asking me for the time, and so that is my unknown. Again, we are only using this equation today, nothing to think about. But now when I do my substitution, I know the value for my speed. So I'm going to go ahead and write in 21.5. Please be in the habit of writing information on both sides of your equal sign when you do your math work. It's a very important habit to create now, so we don't forget to finish the problem for future questions. I know the value of my distance, so I'm going to write that in as the numerator. And then time is my unknown. Now we are going to do lots of practice problems in this class, a whole bunch in the first couple of chapters. So we will revisit how to do the algebra. This is a skill that ideally you have mastered it as a strength before this class even began. But in case that's not the situation, I will definitely do lots of math problems for you guys to help kind of strengthen that algebra skill if it's not there. When we are solving for time, time is in my denominator. So knowing how to properly execute the algebra is key. For right now, I'm just going to kind of quickly tell you how to finish the problem. And in the future, we will definitely continue to explain why we do the things we do in our algebra. For now, I'm just going to tell you I need to multiply both sides by t. So I get 21.5 times t is equal to 68.4. And because t is what I'm solving for, I'm now going to divide both sides by 21.5. And so what I put in my calculator is 68.4 divided by 21.5. If I do that correctly, I'm going to get a value of 3.18139, and then there's more digits in my calculator. One more time, just to review all final answers, the last S in my guess acronym here stands for my solution, which needs to be sig fig. So I'm going to write this final answer as my time is 3.18 seconds. So my need for knowing how to do sig figs is going to be really important. in order for me to get full credit for that final answer. Remember, we're doing the least number of significant figures given for that particular set of variables. So in this case, both of these values were expressed with 3 sig figs, so I'm going to use 3 sig figs in my final answer. Please make sure that you are following the full guess process with all of your practice work. When I grade your quizzes and your tests, you will lose points if you do not correctly execute every single step of this process. Again, we're going to get lots of practice, so please make sure that you are asking for help along the way as we do our practice assignments throughout each chapter.